Without further ado, I'll introduce Professor Enrico Brugnoli. He's the Director of Science of the National Research Council of Italy at the Research Institute of Terrestrial Ecosystems. Professor Brugnoli has a PhD in agronomy from the Faculty of Agricultural Science at the University of Perugia. And after graduating, he specialized in physiological plant ecology at the Research School of Biological Sciences in the Australian National University, and did a postdoc at the Carnegie Institution of Washington at the University of Stanford in California. Professor Brugnoli has a vast experience in studying environmental stresses of plants and ecosystems using naturally occurring stable isotopes. Some of his research interests are environment, climate change, Earth observation, and the water-food-energy nexus. So he will give his talk on the land biosphere, human activities and climate change, avenues for mitigation and adaptation. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. President of Champalimaud Foundation and Francesca Guariglia and Dr. Davide Accardi. I wish to thank all of you, for inviting me. And I start right away to discuss about some of the aspects of climate change. I'm not going to comment very much, scientific results, but giving you some view of where we are and what are the perspectives of climate change. So talking especially about land biosphere, human activities and climate change. What can be done, probably in some perspective. Setting the scene of climate change, we know that there is an increase in temperature, in the global medium temperature, about one degree since pre-industrial levels, changing amount and distribution of precipitation, increasing intensity and frequency of extreme events. We now talk, for instance, of Mediterranean hurricane, which were not used in the Mediterranean, desertification, and so on. So this is the typical kind of graph that we all more or less familiar about anomalies compared to the temperature of 1900. You can see that before there were negative anomalies, and then now we start ramping up with the increase in temperature. This is causing, of course, ice melting, causing melting of glaciers in the alpine environment, mountain environment, and especially in the polar climate. I know that the two speakers after me will talk a lot about the polar, and so I will not talk about this, even though, CNR is conducting several experiments both in Antarctica and in the Arctic. And we know that temperature in some places like Arctic, grown up 4 times than the global level. The same is, or similar is Mediterranean, where we have an increase in temperature which is double of the global average. And there are some other features which are increasing as well. So we have to discuss about signs. How can we say that the climate is changing? Some signs are quite clear. Apart of the flooding in Venice and the increase in sea level and the melting of ice glacier, we know that the 4 hottest years recorded in the world are the last 4 years, 15, 16, and 17, 18 of 2000. And the 20 hottest years have occurred in the last 22 years. So this is quite clear. CO2 has reached 415 parts per million. And the polar ice, as I said, is declining. I show you this graph, which is quite simple, but is also very, very clear to me. It is from Carbon Brief, a site where you can find on internet. If you look at the data, these dots are the anomalies in temperature. And if you look at all the other curves, there are curves of the natural factors like solar variation, volcanoes, And then we have the artificial one, greenhouse gases, ozone, and the others. And if you sum up, I mean, you can see that the most important variation in energy input in trapping the energy into the atmosphere is the greenhouse gases. And if you sum up all the other natural part, I mean, you can overlap, I mean, this curve, which is the total, with the actually observed data. So this is a sign of what is happening, that most is due to fossil fuel variation, but also natural factor can be acting, actually. So using some paleoclimate reconstruction like ice core, tree rings, and sediments, we can see what have been happening in the past, not century, but millennia. And in this graph, we can see 800,000 years before present. And you can see that there is a covariation in the CO2 level, the carbon dioxide level, and the temperature. We can reconstruct this from ice core in the polar region in Antarctica. Now we are trying to do 1.5 million years. But you can see that variation have coincided with glacial and interglacial periods. But CO2 never exceeded 290 parts per million. And now we are almost doubling this level. And the temperature was varying, so giving glacial and interglacial. Then, I mean, we have more recent variation, and we know that actually stabilization of climate happened in what we call Holocene. The Holocene also coincided with a period where civilization of human being started. I mean, we turned to agriculture, and so most part of the land was converted from forest to agriculture. This can be an effect. I mean, it means that we need Holocene, I mean, to develop our civilization, but also can be an effect of humans intervening with agriculture, imbalancing greenhouse gases, and so on. And I will show you. This is the common curve of increasing CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, registration at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And you can see that there is a ramp from 315 parts per million in 1959 to actual 415. And the fluctuation, I mean, that you see is actually the breadth of land biosphere especially. This is our trees and vegetation, which is in summer is bringing CO2 down, and then during winter is growing up again. And this is important because we can show that there is an influence. But apart of this, we know that climate is changing, but we're still increasing our emission, as has been said by the welcoming address. And fortunately, I mean, not all the CO2 that we are emitting is remaining in the atmosphere, because only 44% of CO2 remains in the atmosphere, while about 29% is fixed by land biosphere and 22% goes into the ocean. So we sort of get a discount of what we're doing to our planet by land biosphere and ocean. But now, so land biosphere, and I want to talk about forest, trees, and land biosphere can be a solution to climate change. The photosynthetic response to CO2, as you can see, I mean, is increasing with CO2 concentration and then tend to be flattened, but this is a rapid response. If we take, I mean, a long time, I mean, ecosystem can adapt to CO2, to increasing CO2, and then we also have increasing temperature, not only CO2. And we know that the response of carbon dioxide is like this, as I mentioned before, but the response of photosynthesis to temperature will be increasing until a critical point, and then it will decline because high temperature is not favorable to biology. Another factor is that photosynthesis in terrestrial organism is overlapping with respiration, and respiration instead is increasing and increasing with temperature. So what we have is that photosynthesis can be flattening, response, while respiration can increase. And this will, if this happen, this can bring the land biosphere not as a sink, but becoming a source of greenhouse gases. And that would be another feedback, like the feedback we're registering in the polar ice, like the melting of ice, is reducing albedo, and methane is going to the atmosphere. So it is important to study, the response of land ecosystem, and we're studying this within a European infrastructure called ICOS, Integrated Carbon Observation System. We partitioning component fluxes of respiration and assimilation using an approach of so-called eddy covariance, because studying the turbulent flux over vegetation. And there are different levels, because we're studying at the laboratory level chloroplasts or leaves, and then going to the field with these towers studying the turbulent fluxes. And we have very different ecosystem. You can see here a representation of a Pinus Mediterranean system, Mediterranean macchia, alpine ecosystem, and even Arctic ecosystems. What we're doing is coupling these eddy covariance with stable isotopes, because the stable isotope of carbon and the stable isotope of oxygen allow us to distinguish between photosynthesis and respiration, and between transpiration and evaporation, because there are different signatures in this isotope, in those fluxes. While eddy covariance take the gross fluxes, we can go into the component fluxes, which is quite important to understand the factors before. So we can see that in most of our ecosystem now, the system is working as a source during winter and summer, and emitting something during winter, autumn. But this can be, changed with increasing temperature and with increasing CO2. So normally, if we take some data of 4 years, we can see the changes in land sink activity over years has increased due to CO2, but not only to CO2 increase, but also to nitrogen deposition and fertilization by those depositions. Now, we also have to consider the difference between forest, natural ecosystem, and agriculture. I don't want to discuss too much those data, but just look at the agriculture is emitting CO2 actually, while forests are absorbing CO2. So forests are sink, while agriculture is a source. And so the forest not only fixing CO2, but they also have a strong carbon stocks. So it's the biomass is 283 gigaton of carbon. The dead wood is 38. Forest soil and litter can absorb up to 317 gigaton. In total, is more than 600 gigaton of carbon, which is the amount of carbon of the entire atmosphere. So you can imagine the importance of this. So land use change, in the past and in the future can affect this. Yes, there are studies also showing that, for instance, agriculture can have influenced, the stabilization of temperature in the Holocene, because cutting trees, increased slightly, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And some other evidence from those scientists here, are indicating that the little ice age after medieval time, after 1500, after following the discovery of the Americas, might be due to a land use change due to the great dying of native people. So can terrestrial biosphere represent a solution? Some people is pointing that, well, we can do business as usual and we can just plant trees. If we plant about 500 million of trees more, we can solve this problem. We don't agree with this because, even if we plant a trillion of trees today, this will start to absorb significantly CO2 in, say, 10 years, at least a decade. And so we have to use those kind of technologies like CO2 removal by biomass, fixing it, and then using renewable energy, or the so-called BECCS. But also important, I mean, in modern agriculture, to have a more sustainable agriculture, fixing more carbon into the soil. The soil can be a very strong source of carbon, sink of carbon. So it can absorb a significant amount of what is now in the atmosphere. But even though, I mean, we have to take also some geoengineering, like increasing the albedo of some of our infrastructure, using white or reflecting things, and this can replace partly, at least partly, I mean, the ice which is melting and which is replaced by highly absorbing ocean or land biosphere. And this is what is going to happen even if we do a very rapid cut in fossil fuel emission. I mean, even if we start today to cut, and we will need to go to negative emissions, so absorbing CO2. And even though, I mean, there will be a temperature overshot, so we will go more than 1.5 degrees even if we stop now, at least transiently. So we have to take care of this by some other technology. So what shall we do? I mean, we need to do a rapid decarbonization of the economies. This is a compulsory. And it is also important, I mean, to leave the fossil fuel in the underground, because it can be used to future generation to more noble use than burning for energy. Some other technology might be important. Then we can use afforestation and reforestation, and can be a very strong contribution, increase the organic carbon in soil, negative emission by CO2 removal and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and geoengineering, I mean, increasing albedo and other kind of geoengineering. But even though, I mean, we saw that there is an overshot anyway, and so we need to adapt to climate change. And adaptation is imperative, because the climate is already changed. I mean, we are 1 degree, and we will probably go 1.5 and even more, even if we stop today. So adaptation is very, very important. Just to conclude, I mean, I want to show you this paper, which was a paper by the Council of the United States of America. It was shown to me by a colleague, Kim Holman from Norway. And this consul from America wrote this: the Arctic seems to be warming. It is in November 1922. So he realized that the Arctic was warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunter, and explorer who sailed the seas, I mean, about Spitsbergen and Eastern Arctic, all point to a radical change in climatic condition. So we have to understand now, I mean, about almost 100 years later, that it is time to act. I mean, they realized at the time we should be aware that now the climate has already changed, and we have to do something to avoid the worst effects. So I thank you very much for the attention. I want to conclude with this, which is actually Ny-Ålesund, our station in Spitsbergen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. We will have 5 minutes after each talk, so that you can pose questions regarding the presentation that you've just been able to watch. Anyone has a question? I can start if nobody wants to go forward. I was quite curious about the data of how effective it is to reforest, to plant a tree, and how long does it take until it's actually beneficial and gets to the point of what we want when we do these kind of campaigns. So I guess my question will be, how useful are these reforesting campaigns that we are getting all the time that says, like, let's plant 20,000 trees, everybody gets together for a weekend? What are actually the benefits, and how, or let's say, which rules would we have to obey in order for these new forests that are coming alive to be actually effective in fighting climate change?
Yeah, as I very shortly mentioned, because of timing, of course, I mean, it will take time, because, of course, if we plant small trees, I mean, they will start immediately to fix, but they amount of carbon they will fix will be dependent on the size. So as far as the trees gets adult, then we will fix more efficiently because it expands its leaf area index. All the leaves are expanded and start to fix all the carbon. Of course, it would be beneficial and it would be important, I mean, as a rule, I mean, to plant trees where it cannot be run agriculture, because in a planet where we are growing population up to, say, 10 billion in some few years, I mean, we have also to feed all these people, and so agriculture cannot be cut, like I show in some of the graph. So we have to balance, I mean, agriculture production, food, and also production for bioenergy or for renewable energy cannot be in fighting with agriculture, with food. So we have to balance the nexus between energy, food, and also water, which is connected to both of them.
Okay. Anyone? Don't be shy. Come on. Okay, we have one up there.
How does a more sustainable agriculture look like? Agriculture which would be actually useful in, like you said, that it can also, there are agricultures that are able to keep more carbon in the soil and those that are not. So what is the difference between those?
Yeah, the agriculture, traditionally, I mean, when you start mechanization, start very strong tilling of the soil, and the tilling of the soil is turning the soil repeatedly in years, and all these get the oxidation of organic matter. And so the content of carbon in the soil, in the agricultural soil, has been declining in time normally. But there is now technology that can be more sustainable without all this tilling and with the minimum tillage and things like that. I mean, and a few other applications that can maintain the carbon in the soil, the organic matter, or even increase the organic matter in the soil. And this is very, very important. It can be important also in forests, because also forests which are managed, I mean, can lose a significant amount of carbon. And so the good management of soil in agriculture and forest can be a very, very important thing for carbon. We are also working, I mean, in science, I'm not expert in this, but we have in my group experts in microbiology trying to study the microbiology of soils, I mean, to maintain carbon. Because, as I mentioned, I mean, respiration is not only respiration by higher plants, but also the microbiology activity in the soil, which can increase and can return a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere if it's not managed properly. So I don't know if I answered to your question, but this is the perspective. I mean, soil can be a very strong sink of carbon.
There's one question down here. There's one up there. Só mais bocadinho.
Hello, Professor Brugnoli. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really like the last slide that you showed with the opportunities that we have to change this part. So my question is regarding the response of the industry, for example, in geoengineering or in reforestation, and also maybe something that comes up to me is the use of the wood as a construction material, because once the CO2 is fixed, once the carbon is fixed, then we can keep it in buildings and furniture and so on. So how is the industry responding to these suggestions?
Well, I mean, there are very strong response of industry. I mean, at least in Italy, we were discussing before, and I think that the speakers after me, I mean, will talk about this in more detail. But anyway, I mean, it is very, very important because also, of course, I didn't have time, but also the production of cement, of concrete, I mean, is also a strong emitter of CO2. And so using more wood, for instance, in buildings rather than cement, I mean, they will increase, I mean, the balance. Geoengineering and also circular economy, I mean, is advancing very, very, very strongly. I mean, it's the challenge of the future. I mean, having a more sustainable economy. And a sustainable economy will not be, in my opinion, going back to the Stone Age. I mean, we have to leave our refrigerator because we cannot afford. We have to develop, and so we have to use our refrigerator and our cars in using renewable energy rather than the actual fossil fuel energy. And at the same time, I mean, industry are responding and are very interested. Oftentimes, as we were discussing before the start of this meeting, oftentimes the small enterprise and the industry are looking more to the profit in a few years, while here we have to have a very long-term investment, I mean, to turn the actual economy to green economy and sustainable economy.
Our last question.
Luís Sousa Azevedo, is it valid to say that when you start to dispose the batteries of the electric cars with time, we'll have problems in future?
Well, I mean, it's not my my specialization, but of course, I mean, we should cut, I mean, the fossil fuel emission, and so we know that automotive is one of the strongest emitter together with industry, and as soon as we move to that, I mean, we can move to electricity or renewable energy. Several companies now are producing, say, what is biodiesel, using, for instance, the byproduct and subproduct, for instance, of agriculture and forests and other kind of things. I mean, producing biofuel from those material, actually. And this is also going to circular economies, into an economy where, I mean, the resources are becoming more limited, and so we have to reuse the resources several times in a circular way rather than the linear way that has been dominating our economy so far. So the linearity is in we extract resources, we use resources, and then we produce waste. And the waste is accumulating, and we don't know what to do about waste. All of this must be recovered and then reused and have another life and another life and another life.
Okay, let's thank Professor Brugnoli again.